Okay, so let's talk about the nervous system organization. The nervous system consists of two parts: your central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord, and then your peripheral nervous system, which is peripheral nerves and associated ganglion. Remember that ganglia are synapses outside of the spinal cord. Your sensory nerves go from your receptors to your central nervous system. So, for example, your thermoreceptors are your sensory neurons, right? So thermoreceptors are embedded in your skin, and they go from your skin into your central nervous system, to your hypothalamus. The sensory nerves are afferent nerves because they're going to the central nervous system, whereas your motor nerves are efferent. They're actually exiting the central nervous system. So they're going to effectors like skeletal muscles or blood vessels or what have you. The peripheral nervous system consists of two divisions. Somatic nervous system regulates skeletal muscle, and autonomic nervous system regulates everything else. Your somatic nervous system evaluates your external environment and rules your skeletal muscle. So if you want skeletal muscle to move, let's say you want your biceps brachii to move, you're going to your central nervous system is going to think about it and actually send a signal out to the somatic nervous system to contract that muscle. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves and then 31 pairs of spinal nerves for that system. Take a look at the pathway. So here's your cell body, which originates in the central nervous system, and the axon actually synapses with the skeletal muscle. And so that nerve, that's part of the somatic motor pathway, releases acetylcholine onto that synapse, and that acetylcholine is going to bind to nicotinic cholinergic receptors to excite skeletal muscle. Oh, I can't know to annotate. And so acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, and then that's going to bind to a nicotinic type cholinergic receptor. You guys should practice saying that a couple of times, and that is going to depolarize the skeletal muscle cell. So that's your somatic nervous system. In contrast, your autonomic nervous system regulates or maintains homeostasis in your internal environment. So for example, the sensory nerves are going to evaluate what's going on in the organs and in the tissues. They're going to send a signal to your hypothalamus, your integrators, right, your medulla oblongata. And then the motor nerves connect from the central nervous system to the effector organs. So for example, let's say blood pressure or heart rate's too high, the sensory nerves, the baroreceptors are going to sense that. They're going to send a signal to the medulla oblongata, and medulla oblongata is going to send a signal out to your heart to slow it down. Now, this nervous system antagonistically controls cardiac smoothing glands to maintain homeostasis. These are autonomic reflexes, and so they're automatic. You don't have to think about contracting your heart or whatnot. And then there are agonists and antagonists in research and medicine. Agonists mimic the neurotransmitters, whereas antagonists block the neurotransmitters. Okay, so agonists are molecules or drugs that act like the neurotransmitters, and antagonists are molecules or drugs that inhibit the neurotransmitters or block the neurotransmitters. Here's a little bit of a review of the brain locations. So if you look at the brainstem, the medulla oblongata regulates respiratory rate or ventilation, heart rate, blood pressure, vomiting, swallowing, right, and gagging. And then pons oversees respiratory or ventilation and urinary bladder control. And then the hypothalamus regulates temperature, which we already knew, and then water balance, which is osmolarity, or particle concentration of the blood, like hydration levels. And then below that is going to be your pituitary, and we'll focus on pituitaries when we get to endocrine system. Your autonomic nervous system evaluates your internal environment. They consist of two subdivisions, your sympathetic nervous system and then your parasympathetic nervous system. So let's talk about those. And this is where it's important. I want you to know what these do and how they maintain homeostasis. So homeostasis is a balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Let me explain this for a second. So sympathetic is responsible for your fight or flight mechanism, right? So, and parasympathetic is responsible for rest and digest. So when you are running around, if you're nervous or excited, or let's say your alarm clock goes off and you realize that you're late, your sympathetic nervous system kicks up, right? And parasympathetic mutes or tones down. And then you're eating breakfast, your parasympathetic kicks up and sympathetic tones down. And then you're stuck in traffic, which one kicks up or which one dominates? As you get more and more frustrated that you're stuck in traffic, which isn't an issue right now, your sympathetic nervous system kicks up, right? And then you're sitting in class listening to me lecture, or you're listening to me lecture on the car or in your headphones, and parasympathetic nervous system kicks up. What about when you go to lay down in bed at night? Which one kicks up? All right, parasympathetic. And then when you're out for a jog, which one kicks up? Okay, sympathetic. And so it's not that one turns on and the other one shuts off. It's that they both synapse with, let's say, the heart and the digestive tract to regulate together. So if your heart rate needs to go up because you're running, then sympathetic kicks up and parasympathetic drops. Whereas if you're laying in bed at night, your heart doesn't have to work as hard. So sympathetic tones down and parasympathetic kicks up. Okay? So they regulate your internal organs. If you take a look at them, they vary in different ways. Spinal cord exit, you don't have to know that, but it's really interesting. So the parasympathetic nervous system exits via the base of the medulla oblongata, and so it ends up, it's cranial nerve 10, which is your vagus nerve. Notice that your vagus nerve synapse with all these different organs. The neurotransmitters that they release are different, the receptor types that they bind to, and then activity of target organs. Let's take a look at that. On the left side of your screen is a sympathetic nervous system. Notice you don't see that it originates in the medulla oblongata, but they do. And then they exit the spinal cord from T1 to L2. Go to the chain ganglion, and then notice if we're talking about heart, there's a cardiac nerve that synapses with the heart, so sympathetic nervous system is a cardiac nerve. Parasympathetic, notice most of the parasympathetic innervation is cranial nerve 10, which is your vagus nerve, and that is your main parasympathetic nerve in your body. We're going to, for this lecture, we're going to compare heart and digestive tract, just so you have an idea. When they take a spinal tap, when they want to take spinal fluid, they're going to do it between L2 and L3 so that they don't damage any of those nerve roots, right? Okay, here's comparing and contrasting them. So sympathetic pathways, on the left side of your screen, the red nerves are the sympathetic pathway, and then the okay, so this is sympathetic on the left side of your screen, and then on the right side of your screen is the parasympathetic pathway. So take a look at the first nerve to the second nerve. First nerve to second nerve, how do they communicate? So they communicate using acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is right here. So if you look up, acetylcholine is acetylcholine. So the first synapse, the nerve, uses acetylcholine binding to nicotinic cholinergic receptors, right? And that's the same whether we're talking about sympathetic pathway or parasympathetic pathway. Whenever you're talking about nerves communicating with nerves, it's always going to be acetylcholine binding to nicotinic cholinergic receptors for this class. Then, where is it different? So take a look at the second nerve. So the second nerve synapses with the tissue. And at this synapse, that's where you see the differences. So if we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, the second nerve is going to release norepinephrine onto an adrenergic receptor and activate that tissue. Now, the tissue, depending on what we're talking about, if we're talking about heart, it's going to excite the heart. If we're talking about digestive tract, it's going to slow down the digestive tract. So the target tissue, whatever tissue it is, it has different responses. Take a look at parasympathetic. So when we're talking about the second nerve to the tissue, it's actually acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors on the surface of this tissue and activates this tissue in some way. A couple of things. How did they come up with these receptor names? So if you look at the nicotinic receptor, nicotinic receptor was named nicotinic receptor because it binds preferentially nicotine. So nicotine activates those nicotinic cholinergic receptors. How do I remember adrenergic receptor? I think of norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter, right? And epinephrine is the hormone analog of that. And the common name for epinephrine or norepinephrine is adrenaline. So epinephrine or adrenaline is going to bind to adrenergic receptors. So if you think of adrenaline adrenergic receptors, hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors. Now notice it's called muscarinic receptors because it binds a toxic chemical called muscarine that is secreted from what's found in some mushrooms. And so it preferentially binds the muscarine, and so it's called a muscarinic receptor. Take a look at the first synapse. So notice how acetylcholine binds to that nicotinic cholinergic receptor and excites the nerve. But then when you get to the second synapse, notice how it's a different receptor. So it's still the same category. It's still a cholinergic receptor. It's just a different subcategory. So it's a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. Okay, we can skip this one. This is talking about the adrenal glands. So here are your kidneys. If you look on the left-hand side, kidney, adrenal glands above that, right? We have the outer region is the adrenal cortex, and then the inner region is the adrenal medulla. Take a look at the adrenal medulla. So look at the right-hand side of your slide. Sympathetic preganglion neuron actually synapses with the adrenal medulla. So this cell body originates in your brain stem and synapses directly with your adrenal medulla. It's going to release norepi, and that is going to cause the chromatin cells inside the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine. And epinephrine is going to get dumped into the bloodstream. So if you think about, if you look at picture A, the person, if you're dumping epi into the bloodstream, it's going to circulate around the body really quickly in the abdominal region and in the thoracic region. And so it gives a chance to react really quickly. Catecholamines are locally acting chemicals. The neurotransmitters are chemicals that the adrenal medulla releases. 80% is epi, 20% is norepi, and then there's a little bit of dopamine as well. You can skip this. You can skip that. Okay, the neurotransmitter, I put this in so you sort of have a comparison. The sympathetic division, the neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, and the receptor types that it binds to are going to be alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. For right now, for the exam, you just have to know adrenergic receptors. We'll get into specifics when we talk about cardiovascular. The enzyme that inactivates it or breaks it down is called monoamine oxidase. The old school antidepressants are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So what does that mean? The antidepressant binds to the enzyme so that it can't break down norepinephrine, so that norepinephrine is in the synapse, so that it keeps exciting your nerves and gives you more energy. take a look at parasympathetic division. So parasympathetic division, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine can bind to both nicotinic and muscarinic cholinergic receptors. So practice saying that. Nicotinic cholinergic receptor, and then there's muscarinic cholinergic receptor. An activation enzyme is acetylcholine esterase. We will look at this again when we get into skeletal muscle. But acetylcholine esterase is an enzyme that sits on the second nerve and breaks down acetylcholine. Okay, so it's the same